this. Yes, it works today as well. Hangouts. It's kind of flipping a coin. Yeah. So I don't have any particular update on JSON API besides the fact that I think a bunch of bug fixes. No, actually, one bug fix got in, one security issue got in, which is since this is alpha, this was treated as a bug fix because the module is not yet stable. And that's pretty much it. No other development was done according to what we agreed the past week to let it sit and brew and sip and all those metaphors to see how bug releases. How bug reports are pouring in. Apparently not many. And still, we don't have any clue of knowing if this is because there are no bugs, which is impossible, or because people are finding bugs but not reporting, or they are just not using the module, or just not reaching the bugs, which is also an option. But I guess it's a good thing that there are not many bugs. So that's my update for this week's work on the JSON API front.
Cool. Gabe just pinged me to ask for the link for this Hangout. So I just sent it to him. He's fine. I just sent it to him. That's why I was distracted. For me, I haven't had a chance yet to look into JSON API yet. I have been reviewing a boatload of patches for REST and serialization, a good portion of which will also affect JSON API. So there is a lot of progress on that front, and I'm sure that Ted will talk a bit more about that because he's going, or he's working on one of the, or several of those tricky things to fix. Besides me reviewing things, I have two bits of good news. The first is that the massive test coverage issue that I've been working on got to RTBC this morning. So yay, that should go in fairly soon. And that will mean that many other issues will be unblocked because adding test coverage for them separately often doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It usually makes more sense to just update the test coverage that I'm adding, the big chunk of test coverage. So that will help. And then that's the first bit of good news. The second bit of good news is that I should have time this week to review the JSON API module. So to look for things where it could be a problem if it ends up that way in Drupal core, or just maybe reusing things in core rather than duplicating it, like that sort of thing, that sort of review. I will try to finish this week, and if not finished, then at least start it this week and finish it next week.
I'm going to guess that the biggest duplication will be in the feature set. The fact that we're doing kind of the same-ish thing from a even if it's from a different perspective, and you know. But
that's fine. That we know about. Like, it's a different URL structure, and you need to duplicate some things. That's not what I meant. I meant just on a deeper level than the routing and the request handling being somewhat duplicated. Hello? Hey, Gabe, we can hear you.
Okay,
go ahead.
Cool.
Yeah, that's all.
Just, I don't know, I would say that this is probably going to be an awkward task because there is no very good tooling to do that kind of review. But if you end up writing bugs, make sure to tag them with whatever you want.
Yep, I will.
And so we can just track progress.
Yep. Yep, I might file several issues just as a task and just wondering, like, I think I will run into things wondering, like, why is this done in this particular way and why not use this other way? And I think in many of those cases, the answer can be documentation or a task to prove that the edge case that I thought of, that the code isn't clearly or explicitly covering, that then addresses it. So many of the things I think can be just test coverage and documentation to address concerns. So that's something I expect I will run into.
Right.
And that should be okay, right?
Yeah, I think that's a very good way to approach it. And so I think that the thing that may rub you wrong the most from the first place is the use of the normalizers. It doesn't return a normalized data structure. It's not a scalar. It's an object, and this is because of how JSON API works. The way that we need to track the includes, we need to be able to set some metadata, and so basically those objects know how to normalize themselves. So in the end, it returns an object that knows how to normalize itself. And
interesting.
Yeah, it's because of all the dependency tracking of the data.
So talking about normalizing, maybe that's a good cue for Ted to talk about what he's been working on, which should also affect JSON API.
Yeah, so I've been working on I think there's 5 normalization issues that I've been working on in the REST top priorities. I'm going to put one that I had sort of questions about in the Whiskey chat. And so this issue was RTBC, and I don't remember. It was RTBC, and then I think Daniel and Wim took it out because of nits. But then I was looking at it, and I think I talked about this with Matteo and Wim, is right now there's a entity level normalizer to handle denormalizing for like the menu content link. And the reason it has to do it on the entity level is because besides how denormalizers for field items won't be run when you're denormalizing an entity, because basically the content entity normalizer doesn't override denormalization. So it just does what the entity normalizer does, which is take the values that are sent and then just send it to like the storage create function. So there's nothing that's going to happen on a field level, which means that for the menu links, you have to do it on the entity level. You have to denormalize what's coming in, which would mean that any other entity that wanted to use a link and use the entity schema would have to do their own entity denormalizing. If we did it on the link level, then it would just be for the field item, and menu link, at least for non-how situation, wouldn't have to know about it at all. I don't know if this is worth derailing the issue. I don't know if there's other use cases where this kind of stuff would. It kind of seems weird that we haven't run into this issue, but there aren't really field item normalizers except for entity reference. And the entity reference one adds, when it normalizes, it adds target ID or target ID type and UUID, but then of it. So I was trying to follow that issue, why that was done if you're not going to take advantage of that on denormalizing, but I wasn't really sure what was happening there. But besides that, I don't think there are any field item normalizers outside of the how module. Everything just happens on the entity level. So my option, I think, is to just update the issue and say, oh, this is really edge case, and address the nits that Daniel and Wim had, or to file an issue with the serialization module and say, we need to basically do what HAL is doing, where you have a field normalizer, then a field item normal. We actually might not need the field normalizer because it takes care of lists, I think, and tries to change it for the HAL format. You might just be able to get by with a field item normalizer, but
I think you need both.
Yeah, so that's what my patch had currently, was both. So there's a patch out of the last patch I did out on that issue. Actually, solves the problem. It causes some other problems with serialization, which I haven't or with the rest, but I haven't had a chance to look at that yet. Why? But can denormalize the link on the field level.
So obviously, I have very little context on what the actual problem is, but it seems that the entity level normalization denormalized the field data in a generic way that is no good when talking about links, because we want to link to have the UUID information. So probably we could get away with getting, if we wanted to go the route of adding normalizers for every field, we could just get away with one, which is the base one, the one that was kind of hard-coded inside of the entity normalizer, and then you could override with priorities the rest, and namely, we would override the link item, I think, because the list would be
that's what my current patch does.
Yep, but the interest. But so first of all, I've learned quite a bit about REST, having to fix things up, obviously. But I have basically no experience with the normalization system, so I know very little about it. But I understand how it works, or I think I do, because the thing that is mystifying or super mysterious to me is how it then succeeds in working today. Because what Ted did was add a link item normalizer. That sounds very sensible. I think that's what you would do as well. The thing is that it's not being picked up for denormalizing. It's not being detected, it's not being used. And that's why Ted has found it to be necessary to add a field normalizer that implements a denormalize method, a field item normalizer that implements denormalize. Otherwise, his link item denormalize method would not be called, which is, to me at least, I don't understand.
Yeah, basically, I think I have somewhere in here like the actual code that does the denormalizing. It just basically says, take your data, which is your array of the whole entity, and pass it to the entity create or the storage, then the create function. So at that point, there is no denormalization going on. It's just creating an entity from the data you're giving.
Yep. And so the problem is that so far, nothing in Drupal core, and apparently also nothing in Drupal contrib, because contrib would run into the exact same problem, has implemented a field type specific denormalizer. Because if anything does that, that would fail today. Is that correct?
Well, unless they're extending the HAL one, and they're using HAL.
Okay. So
my code I copied from HAL, because HAL has a field normalizer and a field item normalizer. So, and actually, I haven't looked. I don't really know why certain things get called on HAL, like how the entity normalizer, the HAL version of the content entity normalizer. I'm not even sure why it gets called instead of the other one.
There is a method that probably is hidden by a default implementation, which is it uses this applies pattern that the method that it's called, and there's some random logic. I think in core what we do is we just check if the object implements an interface that is stored in a protected method, in a protected property.
Yeah, so if you're using HAL, you'd be fine using a field item normalizer, because it denormalizes the data on the field level or the field item level. But if you weren't using a HAL, if you were just using the serialization for JSON, then it wouldn't be called unless you overrode content, the serialization version of content entity normalizer.
Right. So this is mainly because the entities ultimately you can create the entity by passing some normalized data. You don't need to denormalize it first.
Yeah.
So.
But I guess the link example is like, and I think it would be the same for entity reference, would be where you're saying, okay, what really is, we really need to consider the UUID as the most important. And so we put that in there for the link. And then when we make the link, we say, well, let's find out what the real entity ID is. So I wasn't sure, there was an issue for entity reference that's already been added where it said, okay, on normalization, let's add the target UUID. But if you use the same process to denormalize, it wouldn't, if you're moving it to a different environment, it wouldn't say, okay, let's take the UUID and figure out what the entity ID is for the reference. It would still look for that same ID. But I mean, that, entity IDs are only going to change if you're deploying to, I don't know, a different sort of workspace environment where you're deploying content. So that's where I was sort of thinking, well, is this an edge case?
So
it looks
JSON
to me like it's a simple...
dealt with. Oh, go ahead.
I just wanted to say very briefly, I think the entity reference example where we are indeed adding the UUID, for example, to the normalization as well. So we have a normalized method specific to that field type. I think it's simply an oversight because the test coverage also doesn't do anything. It doesn't test at all that denormalizing a entity reference field with a UUID is actually resolved correctly. So I think it's simply that, an oversight. Sorry, Matteo, you want to say something?
Yeah, I want to say something and also add a little bit to what you said. And I think that that oversight is mainly caused because we think of denormalization as the process to reverse normalization. So when you normalize an entity, you get target ID and then the ID. So if you take that and put it back in, it should create an entity that points to some other thing. And that's what we are doing now. So maybe that would be more obvious if the entity reference field was normalized into a UUID instead of a...
It is normalized that way. It's just not denormalized that way.
Yep.
Okay. So, okay, cool.
So, yes.
Sorry, then that is not needed. My second thing is that in JSON API, we kind of had to deal with that because of the way that we allow the IDs to be driven by, all be driven by UUID or all be driven by ID. And this is obviously JSON API is not very useful in machine to machine processes. This is more for building apps and for consumers. But we had the advantage there that we know what in the payload structure, we know what is a reference and what is just a field. So if we detect that it's a UUID, or if it's configured to only accept UUIDs, we read that as a UUID. So that's how we got away without needing that patch. But we would benefit from it if something smarter was in the serialization module.
All right. Well, I guess I'll file the issue against serialization. Maybe that will get the attention of, I forget the person's name who is the maintainer of the serialization module.
Damien Lee.
Yeah, and maybe he'll have some feedback on it.
And this is the interesting thing where, so I just finished working on a boatload of test coverage, but this is another area where we actually do need a boatload of test coverage. It's the ambiguity in normalizing and denormalizing is not really acceptable, I think. You need to have very firm, very strict, very predictable outcomes for a given serialization, so a bunch of JSON that we send, and it always should result in the same behavior. And currently, it does result in the same behavior, but it's not what you would expect, and it's a problem. So it's clear that we are missing test coverage in those cases.
Some piece that I think that it would be very interesting to have, and this also kind of relates to some work that's been doing, is that if we somehow had a schema of what a resource can take in, then we would be able to at least have an initial verification that, okay, this payload doesn't look good, and this is why. And then if we build a JSON schema, then there are many tools that can tell us why. And we could say, because this thing that you're sending doesn't look like a UUID. And that would,
it would help a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the other thing that related to that I haven't, I replied back on the, was it the There's a self-documenting issue about, let me put in whiskey. So I replied back on the stuff that I've been doing so far, but I'm sort of thinking this issue is just too, I don't know how this works. It just seems like too old, and it was too originally like really tied to this like HAL browser thing, which I don't know if we still want to use that. So my plan when I had time was to make an issue for basically my last suggestions on this issue, which were basically make a way to export our endpoints to Open API specification, which they use a data model that they point to a data model inside that document that is JSON schema, and then make documentation that will basically build from that document, so that you try to build the documentation for the endpoints to only use that JSON export, the Open API export, so that you know that the Open API export actually does document what our endpoints actually are. Otherwise, you couldn't actually make, if that JSON export wasn't correct, then you couldn't actually make the documentation of it. If you use, like the type data manager directly in your documentation, then you're kind of like bypassing that export. So the idea was to create the export and then create documentation off of it. I don't know, what I had seen as far as like the Swagger UI stuff, it doesn't seem like is really going to document well what we're doing. I mean, it would be a pretty big advantage to start with something like that, but I almost feel like if we just had a simple documentation page that's made on the server side as a starting point, and not do and then a second step would be, okay, make something where you can actually on the page submit requests and confirm and get them back and stuff like that. But that would be like a second step after you actually have all the endpoints documented. All right, cool. Well, I will file that issue, or I'll probably write it up in a Google Doc and ask for feedback from people like you guys.
I think I show you how at some point, because that's been ripped out of the JSON API module, because we are hoping to collaborate with the schemata module for that.
Yeah.
We were doing kind of that, but relying, as you say, on the generated JSON schema.
Yeah. Right now, I'm relying on this schemata module too from the normalization. So I think that would be part of the issue, would be moving that stuff from the schemata into core. Those type data managed normalizer. It has a normalizer for like field item list and field items and stuff like that. I have to go back and see exactly how it splits it out, but yeah.
Yeah. So if you guys don't mind, it seems like we only have 1 minute left, but if you can extend a little bit, I would like to have a couple of words about OAuth.
Yep, I have time.
Absolutely.
Okay, cool. So I was saying last week that I started working on an implementation of the simple auth module that uses the PHP League OAuth 2 server library. And that's so many words. It's basically, it seems that it's the library that the PHP community is standardizing around, and they have like very good documentations of the flows, which is kind of the thing that we need to standardize, because with auth, according to the specification, there are like a million ways that you could be compliant with the spec and still have your own flavor, which means that ultimately clients need to know which payload exactly they need to send you, and it makes it very hard to write a client library that does this with with different implementations. So this library defines all the flows, workflows. It also is opinionated on how you store stuff in the token, because it uses JSON web tokens, which I think that Gabe also has some experience with. And so basically, what you need to do to integrate this in your framework is to write some classes that wrap around the entities. They call entity token or a refresh token, or a client implementation. Like it would be a client would be my Android app, another client would be my Facebook app, and whatever. So apart from that, they also have the repositories, which is how you write and read data for these entities. And this is just basically using the entity type manager in my implementation. So all this to talk about the fact that just with minimal implementation, like only dealing with the Drupalisms, we have a very good implementation of the OAuth spec, and most importantly, it is the same as you would expect from a Laravel application, or from a Slim or a Silex or whatever. Symfony, the Symfony was obvious. I forgot that one. But yeah, this is, I think, that the most important part is standardizing around features, and also it's a very good benefit that we get the weird business logic, which is implementing the actual specification. And I think that this library implements 4 or 5 RFCs, so you get an idea of how you can combine this stuff to write an auth flow that is specification compliant. So I think that this kind of opens the question of should we make this in the core spirit of keeping things simple and not getting too complex or too feature rich, because we're not gonna cover every use case anyways, or because Simple Auth version 1 only implemented the bearer token specification, which is the password grant. Basically, you send in your username and password, and you get a token and a refresh token. So that's what it did, the version 1. Currently, the in progress version that I have already implements that and a bunch more grants, because it's so easy. I mean, you can stop with one. So I don't know if that adds some feature creep, and I want to know about what you're thinking about that.
So can you throw the link to that library in the
Sure.
chat? Or
yeah, sorry.
No problem. So my thought is, so some of that feature creep, is that saying, okay, for this particular token, we're going to tie particular permissions to it?
That's, yeah. So that's part of it. So one part is the scoping, the thing that you say, okay, this is the token for user 1, but with this token, user 1 only can do things that are related to this, and these permissions.
Yeah.
So this is one part that would be a little bit of scope creep. Another part is that with the current implementation, we are not just giving you a token when you submit username and password. There are different flows. And I'm gonna send, or maybe share my screen, because it will be quicker. And so it kind of gives you the idea of the different grants. Right now, we only have or the typical thing that the typical implementation that you think is the password grant. You send your username and passwords, and that's when you get the token. But there are these other three grants. This is the typical when you log in with GitHub or with Facebook. This is the typical thing that you get. So with minimal work, we could get this guy. Right now, we already have this, and these guys. So with some work, we could add this one too. But I don't know if we want to support them all.
Are you guys able to see Mateo's screen?
Yeah, I can see a screen.
Okay, that's just.
I will send a link, maybe the link to the actual image. Maybe that got recorded.
I mean, my perspective is that if you, those extra grants where you say with this particular token you can do X, Y, and Z permission. For me, it's not a matter of like, does it make the code more complicated? It makes like the user experience for administering it more complicated. I mean, could we build it in a way that we put in core the password grant thing, and then contrib can build off that and say, okay, here's some more complex workflows that you could have if you install the whatever OAuth module or something like that. So that, or the not so simple OAuth module or something.
So I have another small, not as specification planned implementation of JWT or JSON Web Tokens, and my approach was not to try and tie them in any way to Drupal's permission system, or introspect Drupal and say we can put these grants in the token by default, but simply to provide like a couple of events that you could hook into on validation of the token, and then also on creation of that token. So if you wanted to implement some special scoping in your application, you just say, on validation, on the validation step, go ahead and pass it to my subscriber, and I'm going to return an access result, yes or no. And you can do your own custom grants without actually trying to like create permissions for it, or deal with entity CRUD access or anything like that.
So would these grants would these tokens not be tied to a user account?
They don't necessarily need to be, no.
So that's basically getting to what I was thinking. On the one hand, it makes sense to support all the things, but on the other hand, it seems like it could make things A, very complex, and B, very deeply intertwined with Drupal terminology and Drupal concepts. And as Gabe just gave the example, there are use cases for not wanting to tie into the Drupal access model, the Drupal user model, the Drupal authentication model, and so on, and just have code to define what is allowed, and perhaps not use users at all. I don't know what the use case is for Gabe, but I can imagine it's some kind of application, and there's only two kinds of access levels, administrators who can do everything, and then the vast majority of users who can just do the normal things, whatever that may be.
That's exactly what it was, yeah.
Oh, wow. Good guess then. So yeah, that's basically, I think what we want to do is make sure that Drupal has better authentication mechanisms than basic auth and cookie. So we want OAuth, presumably, but I don't have enough experience with this to say these particular flavors of OAuth or JSON Web Tokens or whichever. So I personally would lean towards the minimum thing, the simplest thing, that's the easiest to support, the most, and has the most reach in the sense of it helps as many users as possible. So if that's only one or two of the things in the diagram that you just showed, then I think maybe that makes more sense than supporting all the things. But on the other hand, this is still a contrib module, right? So maybe it is okay for this contrib module to do all the things, and then once we propose to add it to Drupal core, we quote unquote just strip it down to only that 90% use case. And then we already have that contrib module that does the 100%. So it's this kind of weighing of things where the most value is. And as Gabe was indicating, or I think Gabe was indicating, that the value, or part of the value, is having that library already be in Drupal core, because it makes it easier to add additional particular implementations. So that would be my suggestion. The 90% use case as simple as possible.
Right.
But what is a 90% use case? Maybe the answer to that is difficult.
Yeah. So what I think that the problem may be is that the most straightforward use of this is just here. This is me. I'm giving you my username and password. Give me a token that it expires and gives me some extra security. This is typically, from a security point of view, this is typically only okay if this is a first-party app.
Mm-hmm. Yep. You mean user and password is something that's only relevant when it's first-party?
Yeah. Yep. So if we kind of agree that we can limit ourselves to first-party, I think that it would kind of simplify things, because then the feature set would be there. If we are thinking about allow Drupal to expose an API, an authenticated API, so anyone can use it to build their applications, and not just me as the Drupal installation owner. I build an application and I make sure that it's secure. So that's kind of the decision. Another thing is that what Gabe was describing, it kind of ties perfectly with the client credentials grant. Would be like, for instance, something that runs on cron and that runs some maintenance task over the API would have that kind of a grant. And good news, the library this library uses the same pattern that he was describing about the subscriber and the event subscriber on validation and on grant, I think. So maybe we could build that. What you had in mind in the same module, because I was facing the problem of when I'm doing the client grant, how do I authenticate the user? Because there is no user that is the Ember app or the Android app, right?
Yep.
You either create it and associate it with the client credentials, the typical client key and ID, and you create a one-off user that then you can configure the permissions and do all the stuff. Or maybe we don't need to tie to a particular user, and we can use the idea that Gabe was suggesting, which I didn't quite follow. Sorry.
Sorry. Basically, in the Jot module, what we're doing is there are two events on validate and on generate, and you just allow people to hook in and add their own key and values to that JSON Web Token, and then on the validation, you look for those keys and values and you return an access result. I think that would be probably what we'd want to include in something like simple OAuth, and not find some kind of user interface for creating these custom scopes or anything like that. And if we were to include that in core, that would be valuable, because then I can imagine other modules in Contrib coming along and utilizing those events to go ahead and extend the creation of those tokens to allow, like, okay, we expect to see a UID here in the JSON Web Token, or we expect to see allow cache clear or something like that. Does that make sense?
I guess I'm not really following. So if you have a token that's not associated with a user and you assign permissions to it, but then presumably it's going to be doing operations on entity, even if it's only view, and all those entity access handlers get fired, aren't they assuming, aren't all of them written to assume that somebody's logged in and you're checking the permissions of that person, that account?
So in my use case, I have not run into that. What ends up happening is I'm like writing a custom controller or something like that,
Okay.
and I just will create in the routing.yaml, right? I'll put a custom access hook on there in the requirements section, and then in there I load the JSON web token and I validate it. I say access result true or false based on some key and value that's stored in the JSON web token.
Yeah. Yeah. So if you're writing your custom callbacks, then it's not an issue. You have your own permissions.
Yeah.
But if we're thinking about using this for something like REST or JSON API, then it's really tied to like, okay, we need to know who the user is so that we can call the entity access handlers.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I see now.
So to bring this all together, so if we look at the diagram again that Matteo just showed us, the top left there's implicit grants, bottom left there's password grants, which is closely corresponds to having a user and have that user log in via an application to Drupal. Top right, we have client credentials grants, which is the use case that Gabe just described. So you have a grant, which is basically an API key, if you will, that gets stored or hard-coded, if you will, even in an Ember, a React, a whatever application. And then the bottom right, there's the authorization code grant, which is a GitHub and Twitter style third-party authentication with redirect and so on and so on. So it sounds to me, and I'd love to hear your thoughts, that what we want is a top right and bottom left. So client credentials grants and password grants, because those cover the typical Drupal use cases. Typical Drupal use cases being Drupal is used as a backend, and there's an application talking to it, getting data from it, writing data to it. So that's the client credentials grant use case. And then there's no user involved there. There is no concept of a Drupal user. The other use case of the other typical way of decoupling Drupal is a password grants. So you have users, and those users do need to log in. And this is an excellent way of doing that in lieu of cookies. So is that a fair summary? We want to support those two use cases of decoupling, and these two types of grants fully address that. And for example, the authorization code grant, so the GitHub style authentication thing, that's something that is more for contrib, because it's definitely not a 90% use case. It's in the example of building something like Twitter, if you will, in Drupal, and then using that Drupal site as a way to authenticate for something else, which is not something core needs to support, obviously. So does it make sense? Password grants, client credentials grants, support those two. Everything else defer to contrib.
Yeah, so it is basically just doing the first party approaches, right?
Yes, I think so. Well, it's listed as machine, not first party in the diagram,
yeah.
but
right. That's true, but still, you're
yeah,
saying
it boils
the
down to
user
the same
and passwords. Yeah.
Yes. Gabe, what do you think?
I think that's a fair summary. I'm trying to understand what they're meaning by a user agent-based app, just to see why we're excluding implicit grants. What's the example of a user agent-based app?
It could be, if I don't understand this wrong, it could be like, for instance, a Symfony app that talks to Drupal, and you have a Symfony user base that you kind of tie to a Drupal Symfony user base.
I gotcha. Yeah. Okay.
So it is not a JavaScript app, for instance, that everything, all the code is in clear. So you can have that the code, the credentials in the code.
Okay. Yeah. So top right, bottom left. That makes sense to me.
So in the top right case here, where they get they have an access token, and then that grants them. Are we talking about here where it's permissions separated out from the user?
I think if unless I'm misunderstanding the approach, if we want to add this for core, we need to integrate it with fully integrate it with the Drupal APIs, and the Drupal APIs assume logged in user to check access for many things. Like
Yeah.
for instance, if you have a custom controller that loads a node, unless you are unless the anonymous user has access to view the node, then you couldn't just load the node if you don't have a user. So I think that there should be somehow a user that ties to a client, but I would love to be proven wrong, because that feels wrong, because we don't need a user conceptually, but the implementation, the Drupal implementation, kind of assumes that there is a user.
But if you don't have a user, then you need to write custom access, right?
No, but not even, because this is not just access for the routing system. This is access for the actions that you execute inside of your custom route, like just loading a node, as I was saying. Loading a node requires some access that is checked, that is probably going to pass on your custom controller when there is no user logged in, because anonymous user typically has access to view content.
Right. I think this problem can be sidestepped in one fairly simple way, which is there needs to be some configuration to define, hey, I want a client credential grant to be created, right? So in the same place where you configure which client credential grants exist or what they should be able to do, well, we should be able to define what they should be able to do, is the point. And if you can just specify roles to be granted to a client credential grant, then we can just create a fictive, a non-existing, a virtual user that has those roles, and then everything will work just fine, because all of the access checking happens either on a role basis or on permission basis, and permissions are assigned to a role. So if you can just create a user out of thin air with a specific set of roles, then that should work fine. So as long as you have the ability to configure which roles should be granted to a client, in the case of a client credential grant, then I think that should work fine.
Okay, so if I understand you correctly, I just linked you to a tweet that I put this weekend. So in there, instead of specifying a UUID to a user, and then you assign that user to specific roles, what you're saying is that in there we specify a set of roles, right?
Yes. Yes. Well, this could work as well. So what you're doing here is you are effectively storing a specific user, and so it's what you let's say. Let's assume it's a React app. Then you would call this user my React app or something like that.
Yeah.
And then you grant the permissions as you would for any normal user. This is fine. This works. I just meant that if you don't want to have that user in your system, yeah, if you don't, then what I just described can make sense. Indeed, present a list of roles, and you can then just create a user entity out of thin air with those roles and never save it.
So on the request,
like
you create the user.
Yeah, that's so exciting.
I see it that you're excited.
Cool. Yeah, because otherwise deploying this would be a nightmare, because you have to deploy configuration along with some special user, and that made almost no sense, and that's why I was going with UUIDs. But yeah, I wasn't thinking straight. Cool.
So Wim, are you saying like on each request, like if you get that token, you create the user and you log them in as that, you give them the role and you effectively log them in?
You just set that as the user or as the current user. Basically, the current user service would return that user, and it would not be a user that is loaded from the database. It would literally be user : create, and then you pass in a random name for the username and specify the roles that you wanted to have, and then it will have those permissions. And so in that sense, it's a virtual user, because
So
it's
you
not
just need to
stored
change
anywhere.
the current user service.
Well, the
support
current
that.
user, I forget how the current user service works. I'm pretty,
There's no need. This could be solved during the implementation.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm sorry to rush this, but I need to go. But we could have the anonymous user decorate it with some client data, and then override the access call and have it check the other stuff. So we could go with this and have the current user just return anonymous, and that should be
something like that. Yeah, presumably.
Isn't this exactly what account proxy interface is for?
Yeah, I was looking at exactly the same thing.
Yeah, I was suggesting that because that's how version 1 kind of works. The version 1 of the module. Anyways, wow, so much stuff to process. Luckily, YouTube will do it for us. It will process everything and store it away. And that's my dad joke of the day. Sorry. I feel bad now. Anyways, this was tremendously useful. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, too.
Alrighty. Thanks.
See you next week.
Bye.
See ya.
See ya.
Bye-bye.
Bye.